Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brother and sister, welcome back to Islamic Notes channel. He was a respected theology professor with a doctorate in comparative religion. For 30 years, he taught the Bible, the Vedas, the Tripitaka, and the Koran. But initially, he simply wanted to prove that Islam was not the true religion. He wanted to show that the Quran was full of errors. However, everything changed when he read a single verse. That single verse shattered his decades-long faith and led him to secretly declare his faith in Islam, before finally announcing his conversion to Islam in front of his entire student body. What was the content of that verse? And how could a religion professor finally prostrate himself as a Muslim? A religion professor, an expert in comparative scripture, discovered the truth after attempting to disprove Islam. However, his plans turned against him, and that was the beginning of his guidance. His name was Professor Edward Michaels. He was born in Texas, United States, to a devout Protestant family. From childhood, he was familiar with the Bible, even memorizing many verses from the Bible before the age of 15. His interest in religion led him to pursue higher education in theology. He earned a doctorate in comparative religion from a prestigious university in England. For over 30 years, he lectured on the world's major religions: Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and even Islam. However, one thing made him unique. He was deeply skeptical of Islam. He believed that Islam was merely a copy of previous religions compiled by Muhammad. He never hid his critical stance towards the Quran. In fact, he once said in an academic forum, "The Quran has too many similarities to the Bible to be considered a new revelation. It is simply a spiritual plagiarism." This statement went viral among academics. But precisely because of this statement, one of his colleagues challenged him, "Then write a book. Scientifically compare the Quran with other holy books. If you believe Islam is wrong, then prove it." And that was the beginning of a major change he never expected. Professor Edward accepted the challenge. He decided to write a book tentatively titled Claims of Revelation, a critical analysis of the Quran and previous scriptures. With his academic experience, he was confident this project would solidify his position as a critic of Islam. His first step was to read the Quran in its entirety, from beginning to end. He didn't just read loose quotations, as he had previously done. He even purchased several English commentaries on the Quran and compared them with the Bible and ancient Jewish scriptures. However, as he read deeper, he began to realize something surprising. This text was different. Its language was direct, confident, and spoke as if it were having a direct dialogue with me. He was surprised to find Quranic verses that explicitly refuted doubts, questioned the logic of its opponents, and conveyed a message with a certainty he hadn't found in other scriptures. One of the things that shook him was the following verse. "So do they not reflect on the Quran? If it were not from Allah, they would have found in it many contradictions." Surah An-Nisa 82. Edward tried to find these contradictions. He opened various passages, criticized the stories of the prophets, trying to find inconsistencies. But he found a consistency of structure, values, and main themes that was even more solid than he had imagined. He began to note the differences between the stories of Moses, Abraham, and Jesus in the Bible and the Quranic version. What surprised him was that the Quranic version was simpler, clearer, and free from contradictions. For example, in the Gospels, there are confusing differences in chronology and genealogy. But in the Quran, everything is presented concisely and focuses on moral messages and monotheism. What confused him even more was when he discovered the Quranic defense of Mary, the mother of Jesus. In the Gospels, Mary is only mentioned in passing. But in the Quran, Maryam received a special letter with a deeply touching narrative. "I read Maryam's letter and tears fell, not because I believed at the time, but because I felt honored as someone who had always defended Jesus. And now I saw how Islam also honored his family." One by one, the walls of prejudice in his heart began to crumble. He even began writing footnotes in his book manuscript, shifting in tone, from attacks to questions. But this change was not yet fully realized. He still thought it was merely academic admiration, not spiritual conviction. However, everything changed when he began to explore the meaning of monotheism in Islam. Professor Edward began to enter the most difficult phase of his search, inner conflict. He had taught for years that Islam was nothing but a fake religion. He was even widely known as an academic critical of Sharia, but now his mind was shaken. Every night he couldn't sleep. He revisited his old notes, Christian books, and previous research manuscripts. But what had once felt reassuring now felt fuzzy. On the contrary, the verses of the Koran he had written down resonated even more strongly in his heart and mind. How can I deny something I know is not fabricated? One night he sat alone in his library. Before him lay two great books, the Koran and the Bible. He opened to the last chapters of both. Amidst the silence, he came across a sentence in the Koran that seemed to rebuke him directly. And who is more unjust than one who has been warned by his Lord, then turns away from it? Surah As-Sajdah 22. Edward closed the book slowly. He lowered his head, his hands trembling. Am I one of those who turn away from the truth because of prestige, because of fame, because of fear of losing his academic position? He began to reflect deeply. Visions of his students, his colleagues, and his scientific reputation swirled in his head. How could a professor of religion at a prestigious university become a Muslim? What would people say? Will I be fired? Will I lose everything? However, beneath these worries, a voice kept whispering, but you will have the truth. Edward finally realized that he had been searching for answers, not to win a debate, but to find peace of mind. And Islam, oddly enough, the very thing he had hated, was actually providing that peace. He sat for a long time that night. No more reading, no more analyzing, just silently praying to the God he believed in. "Oh God, if Islam is the truth, then guide me. I am ready to accept it, even if the world rejects it." And from that point on, his heart began to lean. His faith began to grow, no longer as an outside observer, but as a sincere seeker. A few days after that evening of reflection, Professor Edward decided to do something incredibly bold. He discreetly contacted an imam at a small mosque on the outskirts of town. He asked to meet without anyone knowing. The meeting was simple. No cameras, no reporters, not even students. The imam greeted him warmly and warmly. After a brief introduction, Professor Edward said in a low but firm voice, "I don't come as an academic today. I come as a servant of God who has been arrogant for too long. I want to know how to convert to Islam." The imam smiled, his eyes glistening with tears. He said, "Islam is simple. You simply testify with a sincere heart that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger." Professor Edward nodded slowly, then with a trembling voice recited the two sentences of the Shahada. "There is no God but Allah, and there is no Muhammadan, messenger of Allah." At that moment, tears flowed freely from his eyes. He felt as if a decades-long burden had been lifted from his shoulders. His heart, which had been empty until then, now felt full. He no longer cared about reputation or titles. All he felt was a relief he had never experienced before, even after reading thousands of pages of holy books and scientific journals. After reciting the Shahada, the Imam embraced him and said, "Welcome to the big family of Islam, my brother. You have traveled a long way, but Allah always awaits those who wish to return to Him." Edward was speechless. He simply wept silently. These tears weren't of sadness, but of gratitude beyond words. He returned home that night with a renewed heart, as if reborn. However, his journey to Islam didn't end there. The real challenge had just begun. A few days later, he returned to teaching as usual. He still kept his conversion to Islam hidden from the public, but the students began to notice a change in him. His tone was softer, his discussion of Islam less cynical, and he even began quoting the Quran with reverence. One of his students, a Muslim from Turkey, approached him after class and asked, "Professor, are you a Muslim now?" Edward stared at him for a moment, then smiled and said, "I'm not ready to tell the world yet, but my heart has already prostrated." The news slowly spread around campus. At first, it was just whispers, but eventually Edward decided to announce his decision publicly. He held an open seminar entitled, "Searching for Truth, the Spiritual Journey of an Academic." The auditorium was packed. Students, faculty, and even journalists attended, curious about such a controversial topic. In the middle of the seminar, Edward stood on the podium, opened the Koran, and said, "I've spent 30 years of my life studying the major religions. I teach comparative religion, but this time I've stopped comparing and started listening. I'm no longer just an observer. I found the truth." He then raised the Quran and, speaking loudly to everyone present, declared, "I am a Muslim." Instantly, the room fell silent. Some students were shocked, some stared in disbelief, and others were moved to tears. One of the senior professors with whom Edward had often had heated discussions stood up and left the room. But Edward was undeterred. He knew that day was his second birthday. Not as an academic, not as a professor, but as a servant of Allah who had completely surrendered to God. Shortly afterward, Edward began dressing more modestly. He learned to pray, began fasting, and even attended religious studies at the mosque with Muslim students. He also began writing a new book, no longer a critique, but an account of his journey to Islam. The book is entitled From Pride to Prostration, My Journey to Islam. In an international media interview, Edward said, "I lost nothing by converting to Islam. In fact, I feel like I've truly come alive. The academic world can revoke my degree, but they can't take the truth from my heart." Of course, not everyone was happy with his decision. He faced pressure from his university and even lost most of his academic colleagues. But he remained calm. He chose to retire from academia and devote the rest of his life to preaching and writing. Now Professor Edward Michaels lives in Istanbul with his wife, who also converted to Islam after witnessing the profound changes in her husband's life. He speaks at various Islamic conferences and is often invited to give public lectures on the Quran from the perspective of a former professor of comparative religion. At the end of one of his lectures, he once said, "I used to think I knew everything about religion, but it turns out I only knew God after prostrating myself to Him." After becoming a Muslim, Professor Edward Michaels' life changed completely. He not only changed his faith, but also his way of thinking, interactions, and life goals. While he once pursued academic recognition and worldly honors, he now sought only Allah's approval. He woke up every morning with renewed enthusiasm. The morning prayer became his most anticipated routine. He felt that prostrating himself before Allah provided a peace that no amount of praise or professorship could. He told his new friends, "I used to feel like I'd reached the pinnacle of my career, but in reality, I hadn't climbed any ladder. Now I feel like I'm starting from scratch, but this is the real beginning." Although he had already taken the Shahada, Edward felt that becoming a true Muslim didn't stop there. He began studying Tajweed, Tafsir, interpretation of the Islamic faith, and even enrolled in an online Islamic study institute. He wasn't shy about sitting alongside young people or ordinary people new to Islam. He said, "In academia, we are taught to criticize, but in Islam, we are taught to submit." Edward also began memorizing short chapters of the Quran. Each time he successfully memorized a chapter, he felt like he had won a gold medal. For him, it wasn't just about memorizing words, but also about keeping the words of Allah within his heart. Of course, his decision to convert to Islam was not without consequences. One of the most difficult trials came from his own family. His children, now adults, felt disappointed and confused. His daughter cried and asked, "Dad, do you no longer believe in Jesus?" Gently, Edward replied, "It is precisely because I believe that Jesus is a messenger of God that I follow a religion that also glorifies and cleanses him of all slander." This explanation wasn't immediately accepted, but gradually his children began to see positive changes in their father. He became calmer, less easily angered, more patient and wiser. One of his grandchildren even became interested in learning about Islam after seeing Edward always reading the Quran with such serenity. As for his friends in the academic world, most chose to distance themselves. Some considered Edward to have betrayed the heritage of Western thought. Some even accused him of being brainwashed, but Edward didn't respond to hatred with anger. Instead, he prayed that they would one day be given guidance. However, not everyone distanced themselves. One of his friends, a German professor of religious history, was interested in deeper discussions. Initially, they were just emails, but then they developed into weekly online meetings. A few months later, the German professor also secretly took the Shahada. "You opened my eyes, Edward. I thought you'd sink into fanaticism. But it turns out you become the best version of yourself since converting to Islam. Although he no longer teaches at a formal university, Edward has not stopped preaching. He started a YouTube channel where he explains the Koran from an academic perspective, but in simple language. His videos have attracted a lot of attention, especially from young non-Muslims who are skeptical of Islam. In one of his viral videos, he said, "If you want to criticize the Quran, don't just read one verse out of context. Read it in its entirety. Understand its style, study its history, and see what it teaches." I dare say you will never be the same after that. His YouTube channel, Koran Through Reason, has hundreds of thousands of followers from various countries. He not only answers doubts, but also bridges understanding between the Western world and Islamic teachings. 5 years after his Shahada, Edward finally set foot in the Holy Land. He performed the Umrah pilgrimage. Upon seeing the Kaaba for the first time, he couldn't hold back his tears. He knelt down and prayed, "O Allah, I have long searched for you in libraries and conference halls, but today I find you in this holiest of places. Thank you for never abandoning me." His journey to Mecca was a culmination of his faith, deepening his conviction that Islam is the perfect way of life. He vowed to spend the rest of his life conveying the peaceful message of the Quran to the world. A few years later, Edward was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Doctors predicted his life would not last long, but he greeted the news with serenity. He said to his friend, "I have spent my life pursuing worldly pursuits. Now it is time for me to prepare to meet my Lord." He spent his final days writing letters to his children and grandchildren. In these letters, he did not force them to convert to Islam, but urged them to read the Quran with an open heart. He said, "If you want to remember me, read a chapter from the Quran, not for me, but for your own heart." And one peaceful morning, Edward Michaels died smiling after performing the morning prayer. Beside his bed was an open copy of the Quran in a piece of paper bearing the inscription, "Hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakil." Allah is sufficient for us, and He is the best protector. His body was washed and shrouded according to Islamic law. Thousands of people attended his funeral, including former students, fellow lecturers, and even some non-Muslims who had silently followed his journey. This is guidance. It comes without distinction of status, title, or age. It touches the hearts of anyone willing to humble themselves before the truth. The story of Professor Edward Michaels is proof that anyone, even a professor who once opposed Islam, can transform into a true warrior of Tawheed. Because guidance does not come through logic alone, but through a pure heart and sincere prayer.